The high mountain pass was supposed to be a gateway to a new life, but the shattered wagon wheel tells a different story. For Isabella Munro, it's a cage. Stranded in the vast, silent wilderness of the Ruby Mountains, with the first crippling pains of labor gripping her, every shadow could be a predator, and every gust of wind sounds like a death rattle. Alone, terrified, and with her time running out, she believes her story is over. She doesn't know that a man more ghost than human is watching from the timberline, a man whose own ghosts are about to collide with her desperate reality. The snap of the axle was a sound more final than a gunshot. It was the sound of a future breaking the sharp, splintering crack of hope, turning to despair. Isabella Munro felt the lurch deep in her bones as the wagon canted violently, tossing her against a stack of crates. For a long moment she lay there on the floorboards, the dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light, her breath stolen not from the impact, but from the sudden, terrifying silence that followed. Outside the Ruby Mountains of Nevada stood as indifferent witnesses, their jagged peaks streaked with the last stubborn veins of summer snow, clawed at a sky of impossible blue. Down below in the winding pass there was only the whisper of the wind through the gnarled bristlecone pines and the panicked breathing of a woman utterly hopelessly alone. Her husband Sterling had assured her this route was safe. "A shortcut, my dear," he'd said, his voice smooth as polished silver. Away from the prying eyes of the law and the rabble on the main trail. "We'll be in California before the child comes." But Sterling was gone. He and his associate, a twitchy man named Finn, had ridden ahead 2 days prior to scout the trail, leaving Isabella with the heavy wagon and a promise to wait for her at Carson River. Now, with a broken axle and a mule that had spooked and fled, that promise felt as hollow as the landscape around her. She pushed herself up her hands, bracing against the swell of her belly. A sharp, searing pain, low and insistent, radiated through her back. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was too soon, weeks too soon. She had dismissed the earlier twinges as the strain of the journey, the rattling of the wagon, the constant tension of being on the run. But this pain was different. It was a predator with teeth. Gritting her teeth, Isabella maneuvered her cumbersome body out of the wagon. The crippled vehicle leaned like a drunkard, its rear wheel splintered and askew. It was a ruin. The tools were rudimentary, and even if they weren't, she lacked the strength and knowledge to mend such a catastrophic break. She was a woman of parlors and quiet reading rooms, not a blacksmith or a pioneer. Sterling had always taken care of the practicalities, the messy physical aspects of life, leaving her to be the beautiful, placid ornament at his side. An ornament now rusting in the wilderness. Another wave of pain washed over her, more intense this time. She gasped, leaning against the rough bark of a pine tree for support, her knuckles white. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of her composure. She scanned the horizon in every direction. Nothing. No dust cloud from approaching riders, no sign of Sterling's return, no distant curl of smoke from a homesteader's chimney. There was only the vast, crushing emptiness of the mountains. She had to move. Staying here was a death sentence for her and the baby. Thirst would come first, then hunger, then the animals that prowled these peaks, the wolves, the mountain lions. She'd heard howling in the distance each night, gathering what little she could. Isabella made a desperate calculation. A small canteen of water, a half-eaten loaf of stale bread, and the heavy wool blanket from her bedroll. She stuffed them into a burlap sack. She looked back at the wagon, at the life she was leaving behind, the fine dresses, the small leather-bound books, the silver-backed hairbrush that had been her mother's. They were anchors, and she had to cut them loose. The pain came again, a deep, rhythmic clenching that stole her breath and brought beads of sweat to her forehead. It was happening. Truly happening. A sob escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated fear. She was a lamb, tethered for the slaughter. With a final heartbroken glance at the failed vessel of her journey, she turned her face towards the west, the direction Sterling had ridden. He had to be out there. He had to come back for her. Clinging to that fragile sliver of hope, she began to walk each step a testament of will against the rising tide of agony within her. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and crimson, the colors of a fresh wound. The mountain air grew cold, and the shadows of the pines stretched across the trail like grasping fingers, eager to pull her into the coming darkness. Isabella Monroe, a woman fleeing a past she couldn't outrun, was now walking directly into a future she might not survive. High on a ridge overlooking the pass, a man watched the woman's stumbling progress through the lens of a brass spyglass. He was a figure carved from the mountain itself, weathered and silent. His name was Jasper Kane, though it had been years since anyone had spoken it aloud in his presence. To the few prospectors and lost travelers who had glimpsed him, he was simply the ghost of the rubies, a rumor whispered around campfires. Jasper had seen the wagon break. He had seen the other men ride off days ago, and had known with the grim certainty of a man who understood betrayal that they were not coming back. He had watched the woman's solitary struggle, his face an unreadable mask of sun-cured leather and graying beard. It was not his concern. The world below, with its chaos and its heartaches, was something he had climbed this mountain to escape. His life was a ritual of solitude. A small, sturdy cabin built into the lee of a granite cliff, a spring that ran cold and clear year-round, and the company of a hawk he called Whiskey for its amber eyes. He hunted, he trapped, and he read the tattered pages of a single book of poetry, the words a strange and gentle counterpoint to the harshness of his existence. He was here to be forgotten, to let the man he once was die a quiet death. But the woman, she was not just a traveler in distress. She was heavy with child, and now as he watched her fall to her knees, her body convulsed by a pain he recognized with a sickening lurch in his gut, the carefully constructed walls around his heart began to crumble. He saw her press on her determination, a raw, desperate force. He saw the way she clutched her belly, the primal terror in her posture. He lowered the spyglass, the cold brass pressing into his temple. He had sworn an oath to himself on this mountain, an oath sealed with the memory of a small, unmarked grave far to the east. Never again. Never again would he allow himself to be tangled in the tragedies of others. He turned his back, stalking towards his cabin, his boots crunching on the scree. The decision was made. He would let fate run its course. He chopped firewood with a ferocity that was more about exorcising demons than splitting timber. He tended to his snares, his movements precise and economical. But her image was seared onto the back of his eyes, the cascade of dark hair, the hand splayed across her swollen stomach, the sheer, terrifying vulnerability. He remembered another woman, her name, a ghost on his lips. Clara. He remembered the feel of her hand in his, the swell of their own child beneath her heart. He remembered the promises he had made to her, promises of safety, and a future, all of it turned to ash and dust by the cruelty of men. The memory was a physical blow, and he staggered, leaning against the rough-hewn logs of his cabin, the axe falling from his grasp. Damn her. Damn her for stumbling into his sanctuary. Damn her for carrying a burden that reflected his own unbearable loss. And damn himself for the flicker of humanity that refused to be extinguished. As dusk bled into a cold, star-dusted night, he knew he couldn't do it. He couldn't sit by his fire, warm and safe, while she died in the darkness. The oath he had made to himself was born of grief, but to let her and her child perish would be an act of cruelty, a stain on his soul that not even this mountain could wash clean. His past had made him a recluse, but it had not yet made him a monster. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, he went back inside. He moved with a renewed, grim purpose. From a large wooden chest, he pulled out a worn leather saddlebag. It wasn't the bag he used for hunting. This one was different. He unbuckled the straps, the leather groaning in the quiet cabin. Inside, nestled amongst dried herbs and tinctures, were items he hadn't touched in 5 years. Clean linen cloths, a small sharp knife wrapped in oilskin, a bottle of carbolic acid, and a packet of surgical silk. It was a midwife's kit, a doctor's bag, a saddlebag of hope and of heartbreak. He had assembled it for Clara. He packed it with fresh supplies, a skin of water-smoked venison, a tin of lard for ointment. He added a heavy buffalo hide robe. As he worked, his movements were sure and steady, the muscle memory of a man who had once been a healer taking over. He had been a veterinarian tending to the ailments of livestock, but in the rugged territories, a man with any medical knowledge was often called upon for human troubles as well. He had delivered calves, lambs, and foals, and he had delivered one human child, his own, a child who had drawn a single perfect breath before the world stole him away. Slinging the heavy bag over his shoulder, Jasper Kane stepped out into the frigid night. He left whiskey to guard the cabin and began the treacherous descent down the mountainside, his steps guided by moonlight and a reluctant conscience. The ghost was leaving his perch, descending back into the world of the living, drawn by the oldest cry in human history, the cry of a mother in labor. The world had shrunk to a universe of pain. Isabella was no longer in the mountains. She was in a suffocating bubble of agony that expanded and contracted with relentless rhythm. She had found a shallow overhang of rock, a pathetic shelter against the biting wind, and had collapsed onto the cold, unforgiving ground. The burlap sack lay beside her, its contents forgotten. The water in her canteen was gone, and her throat was a desert. Consciousness was a flickering candle flame. In the moments of reprieve between the waves of pain, she would hear the wind, the scuttling of some small creature in the dark, and she would feel a despair so profound it was almost peaceful. This was the end. Her child would be born into a world of stone, and then taken from it just as quickly. Her story would be a footnote, a skeleton found by some future traveler, a mystery for them to ponder. She thought of Sterling, and for the first time the thought was not of hope, but of a cold, bitter rage. He had led her here. He had abandoned her. She was drifting caught in a grey twilight between life and death when a new sound broke through the haze, the crunch of boots on gravel. Steady, close. Her eyes snapped open. A figure stood silhouetted against the moonlit sky, a tall, broad-shouldered shape that blocked out the stars. A mountain lion, a bear standing on its hind legs. Her heart seized, but she had no strength left to scream. The figure knelt. "Ma'am," a voice said low and rough as granite. "You need to drink this." A canteen was pressed to her lips. The water was so cold it was a shock, but it was the most wonderful thing. she had ever tasted. She drank greedily, spilling some down her chin. When she was done, she fell back, her head hitting the rock wall with a dull thud. Her eyes focused on the man's face. It was a landscape of its own, all sharp angles and deep-etched lines, framed by a thick, unkempt beard. His eyes in the pale light were startlingly clear and held a deep, weary sorrow. Who are you?" she rasped. "Name's Jasper," he said, his voice devoid of warmth but not of concern. "Been living up here." He gestured vaguely towards the peaks above. "Saw your wagon break." Isabella flinched, pulling the thin blanket tighter around her. A recluse, a mountain man. Stories of such men were terrifying, wild, unhinged, dangerous. "Stay back," she whispered the words, a faint echo of the defiance she no longer felt. Jasper ignored her, his attention on the swell of her belly as another contraction seized her. He didn't touch her, but his eyes were clinical assessing. "The babe's coming," he stated. Not as a question. "You can't stay here. You'll freeze before morning, and so will it." He opened his saddlebag, the one he had called his saddlebag of hope. He laid out the contents on the buffalo hide with practiced efficiency. The clean cloths, the knife, the bottles. Isabella's eyes widened in disbelief. It was as if a doctor had just appeared from the ether. "My cabin's a 2-hour climb. Hard, but it's warm. And there's a bed. You can have the child there." He looked at her directly, his gaze unflinching. "Or you can have it here on this rock. Your choice. But I won't leave you to die." Every instinct screamed at her to be afraid of this strange, wild man. But the alternative was certain death, and in his eyes, beneath the sorrow, she saw something else, a flicker of competence, of a duty he was reluctantly accepting. It was the first glimmer of hope she'd had in days. I can't walk," she stammered as the pain receded again. "I'll carry you," he said, simply, as if discussing the transport of a sack of flour. And he did. After bundling her into the massive buffalo robe, Jasper lifted her, with an ease that belied her weight. He was immensely strong, his arms like oak limbs. The journey was a nightmare. Every step he took sent jolts of agony through her. She cried out. She bit her lip until it bled. She lost consciousness for moments at a time. Through it all, Jasper was a silent, relentless machine. He didn't offer words of comfort. He offered only his strength, his steady breathing, a rhythmic counterpoint to her ragged gasps. He navigated the treacherous, moon-shadowed terrain with an animal's certainty, his feet never faltering. She awoke to the smell of wood smoke and pine. She was lying on a narrow but surprisingly comfortable cot, a fire crackling in a stone hearth nearby. The cabin was small, a single room, but it was clean and orderly. Shelves lined one wall filled with books and jars. Animal pelts covered the floor, and a large golden-eyed hawk perched on a stand in the corner, watching her with unnerving intelligence. Jasper was at the fire, tending a pot that gave off the savory aroma of broth. He had taken off his heavy coat, and in the firelight she could see the worn fabric of his shirt, the powerful set of his shoulders. "Drink this," he said, bringing her a steaming mug. It was a simple venison broth, but it was life itself. It warmed her from the inside out, chasing away the deep, bone-aching chill. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now. He merely nodded his back to her. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. It was an awkward, forced intimacy. Here she was on the verge of giving birth entirely at the mercy of a complete stranger. a man who seemed more myth than human. "Why are you helping me?" She finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. Jasper stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "No woman should die like that," he said, his voice so low it was almost a growl. "No child should be born with no chance." The pain returned, sharp and demanding. She cried out, arching her back. Jasper was at her side in an instant. He didn't offer a hand to hold, but he spoke, his voice calm and authoritative. "Breathe, ma'am. Just like you're blowing out a candle. Slow and steady." He placed a cool, damp cloth on her forehead. His touch was professional, distant, yet it was a human connection, and it anchored her. Hours passed in a blur of pain and brief respites. Through it all, Jasper was a constant, steady presence. He knew what to do. He timed the contractions with his pocket watch. He checked the baby's position with a skill that was both shocking and reassuring. He spoke only when necessary, giving quiet instructions, his gruff voice a lifeline in her sea of agony. In a moment of clarity between the waves, she felt a need to explain, to make him understand she wasn't just some foolish woman who'd gotten lost. "I was running away," she said, the confession spilling out of her. "From my husband." Jasper's hands, which were folding a clean linen cloth, paused for a fraction of a second. "Most women are running from something. He's not a good man," she continued, the words tumbling over each other. "He's charming, but underneath, there's a coldness, a cruelty. He's a banker from St. Louis. Sterling Bancroft. He got into trouble. Embezzlement. More than that, I think. People were threatened. He said we had to disappear, start a new life in California." At the name, Sterling Bancroft, Jasper went completely still. The subtle shift was almost imperceptible, but Isabella saw it. A tightening in his jaw, a sudden dangerous light in his weary eyes, like the glint of sun on a knife's edge. He turned his face away from her, toward the fire, but she could feel the change in him. The air in the cabin grew colder, charged with a new and terrifying energy. "Bancroft." He repeated the name, a strange, flat sound in his mouth. He knew the name. The recognition was absolute and chilling. Before Isabella could ask, could question the sudden menacing stillness in her savior, her body was seized by the most powerful contraction yet. It was a colossal, overwhelming force, demanding everything from her. "The baby's coming," Jasper said, his voice strained, all traces of his previous calm gone, replaced by a raw, ragged edge. "It's coming now." He turned back to her, and the sorrow in his eyes was gone, replaced by a blazing intensity that terrified her. It was the look of a man staring into the face of his own personal devil. Outside, the wind howled like a banshee, and the fragile trust that had been built in the tiny cabin felt as if it were about to be shattered by a storm, far more powerful than the one raging on the mountain. The world outside the cabin surrendered to the storm's fury. Wind shrieked through the pines, and snow thick and wet began to fall, plastering itself against the single small window pane. The storm was a mirror to the tempest inside Isabella's body, and the one that had just erupted in Jasper's soul. The name Sterling Bancroft was a key unlocking a sealed room in his mind, a room filled with woke screams and the ghost of a woman named Clara. For 5 years, he had hunted for that name. He had followed cold trails, listened to whispers in saloons from Texas to Montana, all leading to dead ends. He had finally given up retreating to this mountain to let his vengeance die. And now fate, in a move of stunning cruelty, had delivered the name to his very door, wrapped in the desperation of a woman in labor. Isabella was lost to everything but the primal, all-consuming task of giving birth. The pain was absolute, a fire that burned away thought, memory, and fear, leaving only the brutal physical present. But she was aware of the change in Jasper. His hands were still steady as he guided her, but they were no longer the hands of a gentle healer. They were the hands of a man preparing for battle. His movements were tight, coiled, his jaw set like granite. "You have to push, Isabella," he commanded, his voice a low growl that cut through her agony. He used her first name, and the intimacy of it was a shock. Now she bore down with a guttural cry that was torn from the very root of her being, a sound of pure animal effort. The firelight cast their shadows large and dancing against the log walls. The hawk, whiskey, shifted on its perch. Its feathers ruffled its keen eyes, darting between the woman on the cot and the man whose calm had been so utterly shattered. Suddenly another sound cut through the howl of the wind, a sound that made Jasper freeze. A dog barking. Not a wild coyote, but the sharp, frantic bark of a hound. And then another. He shot to his feet, grabbing a Winchester rifle that leaned against the wall. He moved to the window, wiping the condensation away with his sleeve. Isabella, gasping for breath in the lull after the contraction, saw the rigid line of his back. "What is it?" she panted. "Riders," he said, his voice flat and deadly. "2 of them, with hounds." Isabella's blood ran cold. Sterling. The name was a choked whisper. He hadn't just abandoned her. He had come back for her. But why with hounds like she was escaped quarry? He must have found the wagon. She said, her mind racing. He wouldn't have left the money. There was a false bottom in one of the crates. Everything he stole. A new horrifying realization dawned on her. He wasn't coming back for me. He was coming back for the money. He thinks I took it. Jasper turned from the window, and the look on his face was terrifying. The weary recluse was gone, replaced by a predator. "Stay down," he ordered. He strode to the heavy wooden door and dropped a thick iron bar into place. He checked the load in his Winchester, his movements economical and deadly. Outside, a man's voice, cultured and sharp, cut through the storm. "Isabella, I know you are in there. The game is up, my dear. A rancher down the mountain saw smoke from this chimney. There's nowhere left to run." It was Sterling's voice, but it was stripped of its usual silken charm. It was cold, hard, and utterly devoid of affection. "Come out and bring what you stole from me, and I might be merciful," he shouted. "He'll kill you." Isabella sobbed, clutching her belly, as another pain began to build. "He'll kill us both. He can try." Jasper snarled a chilling sound. He moved away from the door, positioning himself in the shadows, near the hearth, the long barrel of the Winchester resting on the stone. The second man's voice, rougher and jumpier, chimed in. "Boss, let's just rush the damn place. It's just some old prospector's shack. Patience," Finn Sterling's voice replied. "Let her contemplate her choices." Isabella's breath hitched. Finn, the twitchy man who had ridden off with Sterling. It was a trap. It had always been a trap. The pain was cresting again, bigger than any before it. It was an unstoppable wave. "Jasper!" She screamed, her body arching off the cot. The baby. "It's here!" At that exact moment, the heavy cabin door exploded inward, splintering from a powerful kick. Sterling Bancroft stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the swirling snow. a pearl-handled revolver in his hand. He was handsome, dressed in a fine, snow-dusted coat, but his face was a mask of reptilian fury. Behind him, Finn peered nervously over his shoulder. Sterling's eyes took in the scene, Isabella writhing on the cot. The fire. The strange, hawk-eyed man rising from the shadows with a rifle. His gaze locked with Jasper's. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the wind, the crackling fire, and Isabella's strangled gasp. Sterling's mask of fury shifted into one of stunned, malevolent recognition. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. "Well, I'll be damned," he breathed, his voice dripping with venomous disbelief. "Jasper Kane, I heard a fire took you and your whole family. Pity it didn't finish the job." The world narrowed to the space between the two men. The storm, the birth. Everything else faded into a dull roar. This was not a random encounter. This was a reckoning. The devil had not just come to the mountain. He had come home to roost. Isabella stared from her husband to the mountain man, her mind reeling. "Your whole family?" The words echoed in the small cabin, heavy with a history she couldn't comprehend, but whose violent implications were suffocating. She was trapped not just between four walls, but between two men, bound by a hate so profound it was a living thing in the room. And in the crucible of that hate, her child was about to be born. The revelation hung in the air, thick and toxic as smoke. Sterling Bancroft and Jasper Kane. A brutal past collided with a violent present in the confines of the tiny cabin. For Jasper, the face in the doorway was the ghost that had haunted his every waking moment for 5 years. The man who had turned his life to ash. "You burned us out, Bancroft." Jasper's voice was unnervingly calm, the quiet deadliness of a striking snake. "Over a gambling debt. You and your thugs. You thought I was in the house with them." Sterling chuckled a low, arrogant sound. "A business matter. Your wife was loud. Unfortunate, but that's the cost of commerce. I never imagined I'd find the sole survivor hiding on a mountain playing nursemaid to my thieving wife." He gestured with his revolver toward Isabella. "Now, Kane, step aside. My wife and I have a financial matter to resolve." Isabella's world tilted. Her husband wasn't just an embezzler. He was a murderer. The man who had saved her, this grim, silent Jasper, was the husband of one of his victims. She was carrying the child of a monster, and she had fled directly into the arms of the one man in the world who had every reason to want that monster dead. "The money's not here, Sterling," she cried, her voice shredded with pain and terror. "I left it. I swear it." "Liar," Sterling spat, taking a step into the room. Finn followed his own gun, drawn, his eyes wide and shifty. It happened in a flash. As Sterling's attention was on Isabella, Jasper fired the Winchester. The roar of the rifle was deafening in the enclosed space. He didn't aim for Sterling, but for the floorboards at Finn's feet. Splinters erupted, and Finn yelped, stumbling backward out into the snow. It was the opening Jasper needed. Sterling roared in fury and fired his revolver. The bullet tore through the sleeve of Jasper's shirt, grazing his arm. Jasper barely flinched, using the moment to dive behind the heavy oak table he'd overturned. A second shot from Sterling's gun gouged a deep scar in the wood. Outside, Finn, recovering his nerve, began firing wildly at the cabin. Bullets punched through the log walls, sending chips of wood flying. Whiskey, the hawk, shrieked and launched from his perch, flapping in a panicked circle near the rafters. In the midst of the chaos, Isabella screamed a raw, piercing sound that was not just from fear, but from the unstoppable force of nature. "It's coming, oh God! It's coming now." Jasper, hunkered behind the table, was torn. His vengeance was in his sights, the man who had destroyed his world. But the woman, the innocent woman and her child, was caught in the crossfire. His past was demanding blood, but his present was demanding he save a life. Isabella. On the floor. "Get behind the cot," he yelled over the gunfire. With a final desperate surge of strength, she rolled off the cot and onto the pelt-covered floor, the rough bedstead providing a sliver of protection. Gunsmoke filled the air, acrid and biting. Another of Sterling's bullets ricocheted off the stone hearth, whining past Jasper's head. Jasper knew he couldn't win a prolonged shootout. Finn was outside, providing a second angle of attack, and Sterling was a skilled gunman. He had to end it. He risked a glance over the table. Sterling was reloading his movements, swift and practiced. It was now or never. Jasper kicked a small wooden stool hard, sending it sliding across the floor toward the door. For a split second, Sterling's eyes darted toward the sound, a fatal flicker of distraction. Jasper rose, firing the Winchester from his hip. The shot was true. It caught Sterling in the shoulder, spinning him around with a grunt of pain and surprise. His pearl-handled revolver clattered to the floor. But Sterling wasn't finished. With a snarl of pure hatred, he lunged not for his gun, but for Isabella. He grabbed her by the hair, dragging her from behind the cot, and pulling her up to be a human shield. "Drop it, Kane!" he screamed, his face contorted in pain and rage. "Or I'll put a hole in her and the brat myself." He drew a wicked-looking boot knife, pressing the cold steel to Isabella's throat. Jasper froze the rifle, feeling impossibly heavy in his hands. He was back there in the smoke and flames, helpless watching his family die. The same monster, the same impossible choice. Isabella with the knife at her throat, and her body being torn apart by the final stages of labor, looked past Sterling's snarling face and into Jasper's eyes. She saw his agony, his indecision, and in that moment, she found a strength she never knew she possessed. With a primal roar, she drove her elbow backward with all her might, striking Sterling squarely in his wounded shoulder. He howled in agony, his grip slackening for just an instant. It was all the time Jasper needed. He didn't fire the rifle. Instead, he dropped it and charged, closing the distance in 2 long strides. He slammed into Sterling like a battering ram, and the 2 men crashed to the floor. The knife skittered away into the shadows. It was no longer a gunfight. It was a brawl, brutal and raw. They rolled on the floor amidst the splinters and spent cartridges' fists landing with wet, sickening thuds. Sterling was slick and vicious, but Jasper was fueled by 5 years of cold fury. He was stronger, his rage a deeper, purer thing. As they fought, a new sound pierced the chaos. A sound that stopped everything. A high, thin, wavering cry. The cry of a newborn baby. Both men froze. In the sudden shocked silence broken only by the whimpering wind outside and their own ragged breathing, the sound was impossibly loud, impossibly pure. A new life had entered the world in the very heart of the violence meant to end it. Sterling, his momentary distraction turning to revulsion, shoved a dazed Jasper away and scrambled for his fallen revolver. But his eyes fell on Isabella. She was slumped against the cot, exhausted but fiercely alive, cradling a tiny, squirming bundle wrapped in her own torn petticoat. She looked at Sterling, her husband, with eyes that held no love, no fear, only a cold, hard judgment. That hesitation cost him. Jasper, recovering, tackled him again. This time there was no finesse. It was raw vengeance. He slammed Sterling's head against the stone hearth. Once. Twice Sterling went limp. Jasper rose, his chest, heaving his arm, bleeding freely. His face a mask of bruises and fury. He stood over the unconscious form of his nemesis, the man he had hunted for so long. The urge to finish it, to send Bancroft's soul to hell, was a physical fire in his veins. But then he heard the cry again, softer this time. A small questioning sound. He turned. Isabella was looking at him, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the sweat and grime. In her arms, the baby, a symbol of impossible survival, flexed its tiny hands. Slowly, painfully, Jasper Kane let go of the hate that had been his only companion for 5 years. He walked over to the unconscious Finn outside and retrieved the outlaw's gun, then secured Sterling's hands and feet with rope from his pack. The reckoning was over. The devil was defeated not just by fists and bullets, but by the cry of a child born in a storm. The rain that had begun to fall was washing the snow from the trees, and it felt like it was washing the blood from the world. The silence that descended upon the cabin was more profound than any that had come before. The storm had broken, and the pre-dawn light, soft and grey, filtered through the window and the splintered doorway. The only sounds were the gentle crackle of the dying fire, the steady drip of water from the eaves, and the soft snuffing breaths of the newborn in Isabella's arms. Jasper moved like a man in a dream. He checked that Sterling and Finn were securely bound and unconscious, dragging Finn's inert form just inside the door to prevent him from freezing. His own pain, the burn on his arm. The throbbing bruises was a distant hum, drowned out by the seismic shift in his soul. He approached Isabella, his movements hesitant, almost shy. The fearsome avenger was gone, again replaced by the weary, sorrowful recluse. He knelt before her, not as a savior, but as a witness. Is it? He couldn't finish the sentence. A boy. Isabella whispered, her voice rough with exhaustion, but laced with a fierce, protective wonder. She pulled back the cloth. The baby's face was red and wrinkled, his eyes squeezed shut, his tiny mouth working silently. He was perfect. Jasper reached out a trembling hand, his calloused, blood-stained fingers hovering over the child's head. He looked from the infant to Isabella, and his eyes were filled with a complex storm of emotions, grief for what he had lost, awe for what she had created, and a profound, aching tenderness. I have some things, he stammered, his voice thick. He went to the chest, the same one from which he'd pulled the midwife's supplies. From the very bottom, beneath the linens and herbs, he retrieved a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He brought it to her and unwrapped it. Inside were tiny, exquisitely knitted baby clothes. A small woolen cap, booties a soft gown. They were yellowed with age, but perfectly preserved. They were for my son. Jasper, said his voice breaking on the last word. His name was Daniel. He lived for less than an hour. Tears welled in Isabella's eyes, for this man's immense loss, for the impossible tragic circle of fate that had brought them together. Jasper, she said, her voice full of an emotion too deep for simple gratitude. I am so sorry. He would want your boy to be warm, Jasper said gruffly, pressing the clothes into her hand. Together, in the quiet communion of shared sorrow and newfound hope, they cleaned and dressed the infant. Jasper's large, clumsy hands were surprisingly gentle as he helped swaddle the boy in the clothes meant for his own lost child. When they were done, Isabella looked down at her son snug and warm against all odds. "I think I'll call him Dawn," she said softly. "Because he came with the morning." Jasper nodded, a lump in his throat. Dawn. A new beginning, born from the darkest night. They spent the day in a state of surreal peace. Jasper tended to his wound, his movements slow and deliberate. He made more broth, and they shared it in silence, the presence of the sleeping child, a conversation in itself. The bound forms of Sterling and Finn were a grim reminder of the violence, but they had no power in the cabin now. They were relics of a past that had been vanquished. As evening approached, they knew a decision had to be made. "Sheriff's office is in Garnet Creek," Jasper said, staring into the rebuilt fire. "It's a 2-day ride. I'll take them in." "What about us?" Isabella asked, clutching Dawn a little tighter. The thought of being left alone again, even in safety, was terrifying. Jasper looked at her, at the child in her arms, and at the small cabin that had been his sanctuary and his prison. The mountain had kept him safe from the world, but it had also kept him from living. "This mountain is full of ghosts," he said, his voice heavy. "Mine, and now yours. It's no place to raise a boy." He took a deep breath. "When I'm done in Garnet Creek, I won't be coming back here. I thought I was hunting Bancroft for revenge, but maybe I was just looking for a reason to come down off this mountain." He looked at her, a question in his eyes. He didn't know how to ask. Isabella gave him a small, weary smile. "I was heading for California, looking for a new life. It seems I found one, just not the one I was expecting." She met his gaze. "We have no ties, you and I, other than this one terrible night. But I find myself unwilling to face the world alone. And I think perhaps you are too." It wasn't a declaration of love or even of friendship. It was something more fundamental, an alliance of survivors. Two broken souls who had, by some miracle, found a way to piece each other together in the heart of a storm. "I have a little money saved," Jasper said quietly, "from trapping. Enough for a start. Somewhere new. Oregon, maybe. They say the land is green there." "I've never seen Oregon," Isabella replied. And that was all that needed to be said. 3 days later, a strange procession made its way down the winding mountain pass. Jasper led the way on a sturdy mule he'd kept hidden, leading a second mule on which the bound and gagged forms of Sterling, Bancroft, and Finn were tied. Behind him rode Isabella, cradling baby Dawn in a sling Jasper had fashioned from a blanket. She looked fragile, but resolute, her eyes fixed on the horizon ahead. As they rounded a bend, she looked back one last time at the high, jagged peaks of the Ruby Mountains. They looked different now, not like a prison, but like a crucible, a place of fire and death that had, against all logic, forged a new life and a new uncertain future. She turned away, her gaze settling on the broad back of the man, leading them toward the promise of Greenlands and a life beyond the ghosts. The saddlebag on his mule was no longer a bag of hope. It was just a bag. The hope was now something they carried within themselves. The descent from the Ruby Mountains was a journey from one world to another. The raw, elemental silence of the peaks gave way to the mundane noises of civilization as they approached the dusty outpost of Garnet Creek. The clatter of a blacksmith's hammer, the distant laughter from a saloon, the lowing of cattle in a stock pen. Each sound was an assault on senses accustomed to wind and whispers. For Jasper and Isabella, the scrutiny of the townsfolk felt more threatening than the gaze of a predator. People stopped and stared at their strange procession, the grim, bruised man leading the mules, the pale but resolute woman clutching a newborn, and the two notorious figures slumped and bound behind them. The sheriff's office was a squat, sun-baked adobe building with a faded sign. Jasper halted the mules, the dust settling around them like a shroud. For a moment, he and Isabella simply sat, absorbing the reality of their arrival. The fight on the mountain had been a primal, clear-cut battle for survival. This next part would be a battle of words, of belief, of law. "I'll do the talking," Jasper said, his voice low as he dismounted. "We'll do it together," Isabella corrected him gently, her gaze steady. "It's our story." A stout man with a drooping moustache and a weary but intelligent face emerged from the office. A tarnished star was pinned to his vest. "Saw you ride in," he said, his eyes taking in the entire scene with a practiced, sweeping glance. "That's a hell of a story you're bringing with you, I reckon." "I'm Sheriff Roscoe." Jasper nodded his hand, resting near the pistol he'd taken from Finn, a weapon he was ready to surrender. "These men are Sterling Bancroft and his associate Finn. They're wanted for embezzlement in St. Louis, and for attempted murder and kidnapping up on that mountain." Sheriff Roscoe's eyes lingered on Sterling's handsome, bruised face, then on Isabella and the sleeping infant. "And the murder part. A fire 5 years back." Near the Cimarron, Jasper said, his voice tight. "He killed my wife and son." The sheriff's expression didn't change, but a flicker of understanding crossed his face. He'd seen revenge before. He gestured with his head. "Get him inside. We'll get your statements. Separately." The process was draining. Jasper, in a small, stuffy back room, recounted the events with blunt, factual accuracy. He spoke of the wagon, the labor, the attack on the cabin, and the older crime that had fueled his 5 years of solitude. His story was stark and unadorned, the testimony of a man unused to explaining himself. In the main office, Isabella told her side. She spoke of Sterling's charm, curdling into cruelty of the flight from St. Louis, and the terrifying realization that he had come back not for her, but for the stolen money. Her voice, though tired, was clear and credible. She was articulate, and her fear, her exhaustion, and her fierce maternal protectiveness were undeniable. She clutched Dawn to her chest, the living proof of her ordeal. After an hour, Sheriff Roscoe brought them back together. He had a telegraph, flimsy, in his hand. "Sent a wire to the marshal in St. Louis an hour ago. Just got one back." He looked at Sterling, who was now conscious and sneering from a cell. "Seems you're quite the celebrity, Mr. Bancroft. There's a federal warrant out for you. Robbery and suspicion of arson leading to death. The bounty is substantial." A wave of relief so profound it was dizzying washed over Isabella. They were believed. The weight of Sterling's lies, a burden she had carried for years, was finally lifted. The sheriff turned to Jasper. "That bounty belongs to you, Kane. You brought him in. It's more than enough to buy a man a fresh start." Roscoe's gaze softened as he looked at Isabella and the baby. A whole family, even. Later, after their wounds were tended by the town doctor, and Sterling and Finn were securely locked away to await a federal marshal, Roscoe directed them to the town's only boarding house. In a small, clean room with a real bed and a wash basin, the reality of their freedom began to sink in. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but filled with unspoken understanding. Isabella laid Dawn down on the bed, and he stretched his tiny limbs, making a soft cooing sound. Jasper stood by the window looking out at the dusty street, his broad shoulders silhouetted by the setting sun. "He called us a family," Jasper said quietly, not turning around. "We are Isabella," replied her voice, soft but certain. "Not by blood or by law, perhaps, but by fire and storm, and the grace of God. That's a bond stronger than most." He turned then and looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a victim to be rescued or a problem to be solved, but as the woman who had inadvertently pulled him back into the world. He saw the strength in her tired eyes, the resilience that had carried her through an impossible ordeal. "The sheriff is right," he said, his voice husky. "The money is enough. For passage, for land, for a house in Oregon." It was no longer a desperate suggestion on a mountainside, but a tangible offer, a foundation upon which they could build. Isabella walked over to him, stopping just before him, the space between them charged with a fragile, hopeful energy. "Jasper Kane," she said, "I think I would like to see Oregon." He reached out his hand, hesitating just as it had in the cabin over her son's head. Then, with a newfound certainty, he gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray tear she hadn't realized had fallen. It was a simple touch, but it was a promise of a shared future, of a home built not on a mountain of ghosts, but in a valley of green hope. They had walked out of the darkness and into the daylight, and for the first time the light did not feel like a thing to be feared. It felt like a beginning. That night on the mountain, a story that began with betrayal and certain death was rewritten by courage and the impossible arrival of a new life. Isabella and Jasper, two strangers thrown together by the cruel whims of fate, found more than just survival in that tiny cabin. They found a reason to face a new dawn. Their journey was far from over, but they would no longer walk it alone. Bound by the violence of their past and the fragile promise of the future they held in their arms, they rode away from the mountain, leaving their ghosts behind in the silent peaks. Their story is a testament to the fact that even in the harshest wilderness, in the darkest of nights, hope can be delivered by the most unexpected hands. If their incredible journey of survival and redemption moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs a story of hope. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true tales of the American West, where legends were forged in fire and faith.